Chapter 3 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. After his brother's death in 1842, Thoreau continued to live in Emerson's house, the bereavement which each of the two friends had recently undergone, for little Waldo, Emerson's favorite child, had died early in the same year, being doubtless instrumental in bringing them more closely together. Thoreau's regard for Emerson and Mrs. Emerson was very deep, and it was natural that a young man, even when possessed of Thoreau's strength of character, should be lastingly influenced by so commanding a personality as Emerson's. It has been remarked by several of those who knew both men that Thoreau unconsciously caught certain of the traits of Emerson's voice and expression, and even of his personal appearance. That he deliberately imitated Emerson is declared on the best authority to be an idle and untenable assertion. The following account of Thoreau's receptivity in this respect is given by one of his college classmates, whom I have already quoted. Not long after I happened to meet Thoreau in Mr. Emerson's study at Concord, the first time we had come together after leaving college, I was quite startled by the transformation that had taken place in him. His short figure and general cast of countenance were of course unchanged, but in his manners, in the tones of his voice, in the modes of expression, even in the hesitations and pauses of his speech, he had become the counterpart of Mr. Emerson. Thoreau's college voice bore no resemblance to Mr. Emerson's, and was so familiar to my ear that I could have readily identified him by it in the dark. I was so much struck by the change that I took the opportunity, as they sat near together talking, of listening with closed eyes, and I was unable to determine with certainty which was speaking. I do not know to what subtle influences to ascribe it, but after conversing with Mr. Emerson for even a brief time, I always found myself able and inclined to adopt his voice and manner of speaking. Footnote: Ralph Waldo Emerson by Rev. D. G. Haskins. End footnote. The change noticed in Thoreau was not due only to the stimulating influence of Emerson's personality, though that doubtless was the immediate means of effecting his awakening. Underneath the sluggish and torpid demeanor of his life at the university, there had been developing, as his schoolmates afterwards recognized, the strong, stern qualities which were destined to make his character remarkable, and these had now been called into full play both by the natural growth of his mind and by the opportunities afforded in the brilliant circle of which he was a member. In later years, says John Weiss, who knew him well at Harvard, his chin and mouth grew firmer, as his resolute and audacious opinions developed. The eyes twinkled with the latent humor of his criticisms of society. It was a veritable transformation, an awakening of the dormant intellectual fire, and it has been ingeniously suggested that the transformation of Donatello in Hawthorne's novel may have been founded in the first place on this fact in the life of Thoreau. So, too, with regard to his social and ethical opinions. It would have been strange if the youth of 25 had not been in some degree affected and influenced by the philosopher of 40. But the freshness and originality of his genius, in all essential respects, is none the less incontestable. Thoreau, in fact, was one of the very few men by whom Emerson was himself in some degree impressed. We are told by Dr. E. W. Emerson that his father delighted in being led to the very inner shrines of the wood god by this man, clear-eyed and true and stern enough to be trusted with their secrets. And there is no doubt that Thoreau influenced him perceptibly in the direction of a more diligent and minute study of nature, and a simpler and austerer mode of life. He differed in one important respect, both from Emerson and from the other members of the Emersonian circle of transcendentalists, in his aboriginal hardihood and vigor. To them, Concord was a suitable place of adoption. To him, it was the place of his birth. The simplicity of living, personal independence, and intimacy with wild nature, which to the others involved more or less a deliberate effort, were in his case an innate and unconscious instinct. With Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was the latest addition to the Society of Concord, Thoreau had perhaps little in common except his friendship with Ellery Channing, though courteous relations seem to have subsisted between them. Some of the references to Thoreau in Hawthorne's journal have a touch of the petulance and harshness of judgment to which Hawthorne was rather prone when recording his impressions of his acquaintances. But on the whole, he speaks of Thoreau with unusual admiration and respect. "Mr. Thoreau dined with us yesterday," he writes on the 1st of September, 1842. "He is a singular character, a young man with much of wild, original nature still remaining in him, and so far as he is sophisticated, it is in a way and method of his own. He is as ugly as sin, long-nosed, queer-mouthed, and with uncouth and somewhat rustic though courteous manners corresponding very well with such an exterior. But his ugliness is of an honest and agreeable fashion, and becomes him much better than beauty." No reliance is to be placed in some further remarks of Hawthorne's, to the effect that Thoreau's sojourn in Emerson's household had been burdensome to his host, for all the facts point strongly in the other direction. On another occasion we learn that Thoreau rowed Hawthorne on the Concord River in a boat built and used by himself and his brother in their week's excursion to the Merrimack in 1839, and Hawthorne, delighted at Thoreau's skill in paddling, decided to purchase the boat and change its name from Musketaquid to Pond Lily. But the art of managing a canoe, which Thoreau had learnt from some Indians who had visited Concord a few years previously, was not to be acquired in a day. "Mr. Thoreau had assured me," writes Hawthorne plaintively, "that it was only necessary to will the boat to go in any particular direction, and she would immediately take that course, as if imbued with the spirit of the steersman. It may be so with him, but it is certainly not so with me." The difficulty once mastered, Hawthorne took much pleasure in his new purchase, and seems to have been inspired by something of Thoreau's enthusiasm for the wildness of open-air life. "Oh, that I could run wild!" he exclaims, when recording his first successful voyage in the Pond Lily. "That is, that I could put myself in a true relation with nature, and be on friendly terms with all congenial elements." By the middle of 1842, the Dial, which had never been prosperous from a pecuniary point of view, was in severe straits, and the editorship, having been resigned by Margaret Fuller, was undertaken by Emerson himself, in which work he was largely assisted by Thoreau, who was then living in his house. It is said that Thoreau not only canvassed for new subscribers, read proof sheets, and selected passages from the ethnical scriptures of the Oriental philosophers, which formed one of the features of the Dial under Emerson's management, but also acted as sole editor on one or two occasions during his friend's absence. Footnote: Volume 3, Number 3, is said to have been edited by Thoreau. End footnote. A large number of Thoreau's writings were inserted by Emerson, whose estimate of his ability was far higher than that held by Margaret Fuller, so that the young author was now becoming recognized as one of the leaders of transcendental thought. The Dial for July 1842 contained his delightful essay on the natural history of Massachusetts, to which Emerson prefixed an introductory note in which he hinted that Isaac Walton and White of Selborne had now a worthy successor. The Winter Walk, another essay of the same character and of almost equal merit, appeared in the Dial a year later. In July 1842, Thoreau, accompanied by a friend, went on a 3 days' excursion to Wachusett, a mountain to the west of Concord, the blue wall, he calls it, which bounds the western horizon, which, from its isolated position, forms a conspicuous feature in the landscape and is familiar by name to all readers of his writings. More than once he expresses a feeling of sympathy with this solitary height. But special I remember thee, Wachusett, who, like me, standest alone without society. His account of the walk, and how they camped a night on the mountain, was published the following year in the Boston Miscellany, under the title of A Walk to Wachusett. Wachusett, he wrote, in describing the view from the summit, is in fact the observatory of the state. There lay Massachusetts, spread out before us in length and breadth like a map. Thoreau's love of mountains is exemplified in many passages of his diary, and the occasional excursions which he made to the lofty outlying ranges visible from the Concord hills formed some of the most pleasing episodes in his life. A mountain chain, he says, determines many things for the statesman and philosopher. The improvements of civilization rather creep along its sides than cross its summit. How often is it a barrier to prejudice and fanaticism? In passing over these heights of land, through their thin atmosphere, the follies of the plain are refined and purified, and as many species of plants do not scale their summits, so many species of folly no doubt do not cross the Alleghanies. Thoreau's predilection for solitude and indifference or dislike to society in the ordinary sense of the word may be gathered from a good deal of what has already been related of him. There was an aloofness and reserve in his nature which, together with his stern and lofty ideals, made him appear at times somewhat unbending and unapproachable. It was no question of being better or worse than the generality of men. He was different, and the sympathy which he could not find in civilized man he sought in wild nature, though well aware that nature herself is nothing except in her relation to man. "I feel," he said, "that my life is very homely, my pleasures very cheap. Joy and sorrow, success and failure, grandeur and meanness, and indeed most words in the English language do not mean for me what they do for my neighbors. I see that my neighbors look with compassion on me, that they think it is a mean and unfortunate destiny which makes me to walk in these fields and woods so much, and sail on this river alone. But so long as I find here the only real Elysium, I cannot hesitate in my choice. To say, as is often said, that Thoreau was unsocial is, however, incorrect, except in a limited and qualified degree. He enjoyed common people, says Channing. He relished strong, acrid characters. The rough, honest farmers of Concord were his especial favorites, and in their company he could show plenty of that good fellowship of which he appeared, under some conditions, to be deficient. The impression which he left on his friends in Emerson's household, after his 2 years' residence there, was a wholly agreeable one. He was by no means unsocial, says Dr. E. W. Emerson, but a kindly and affectionate person, especially to children, whom he could endlessly amuse and charm in most novel and healthful ways. With grown persons he had tact and high courtesy, though with reserve. But folly or pretense or cant or subserviency excited his formidable attack. Early in 1843, Thoreau ceased to live in Emerson's house, having accepted the offer of a tutorship in the family of Judge Emerson, the brother of the Concord philosopher, who was then living in Staten Island, near New York. Before leaving Concord to take up this duty, he wrote as follows to Emerson, who was lecturing at New York. At the end of this strange letter, I will not write what alone I had to say. To thank you and Mrs. Emerson for your long kindness to me. It would be more ungrateful than my constant thought. I have been your pensioner for nearly 2 years, and still left free as the sky. It has been as free a gift as the sun or the summer, though I have sometimes molested you with my mean acceptance of it. I, who have failed to render even those slight services of the hand which would have been for a sign at least, and by the fault of my nature have failed of many better and higher services. But I will trouble you no more with this, but for once thank you and heaven. It is probable that some stanzas of Thoreau's entitled The Departure were written about this time, when he had just left with regret the friends whose house had for 2 years been his home. Several months were spent by Thoreau in Staten Island. Here, in his spare hours during the spring and summer of 1843, he continued his walking excursions as regularly as at Concord, and was frequently mistaken by the inhabitants for a busy surveyor, who was studying every yard of the ground with a view to some extensive speculation. From an old ruined fort he used to watch the emigrant vessels pass up the narrow channel from the wide outer bay and go on their course to New York, or, as the case might be, remain in quarantine at Staten Island, when the passengers would be allowed to go ashore and refresh themselves on that artificial peace of the land of liberty. From the low hills in the interior of the island, among the homesteads where the Huguenots had been the first settlers, he could see the long procession of outgoing ships, stretching far as the eye could reach, with stately march and silken sails, as he describes it. At other times he roamed along the desolate sandy shore, where packs of half-wild dogs were on the lookout for carcasses of horses or oxen washed up by the tide. An island, he says, in his Week, always pleases my imagination, even the smallest, as a continent and integral portion of the globe. I have a fancy for building my hut on one. Even a bare, grassy isle, which I can see entirely over at a glance, has some undefined and mysterious charms for me. It was at Staten Island that Thoreau wrote those beautiful and highly characteristic stanzas on the sea. My life is like a stroll upon the beach, as near the ocean's edge as I can go. My tardy steps its waves sometimes o'erreach, sometimes I stay to let them overflow. My sole employment 'tis, and scrupulous care, to place my gains beyond the reach of tides, each smoother pebble and each shell more rare, which ocean kindly to my hand confides. I have but few companions on the shore. They scorn the strand who sail upon the sea. Yet oft I think the ocean they've sailed o'er is deeper known upon the strand to me. The middle sea contains no crimson dulse, its deeper waves cast up no pearls to view. Along the shore my hand is on its pulse, and I converse with many a shipwrecked crew. During the sojourn in Staten Island, Thoreau was frequently in New York, where he made the acquaintance of W. H. Channing, Edward Palmer, Lucretia Mott, Henry James, Horace Greeley, and other persons of note. In this city, he wrote to his sister on 21st July, I have seen, since I last wrote, W. H. Channing, at whose house in 15th Street I spent a few pleasant hours, discussing the all-absorbing question, what to do for the race. Also Horace Greeley, editor of the Tribune, who is cheerfully in earnest at his office of all work, a hearty New Hampshire boy as one could wish to meet, and says, "Now be neighborly." With Greeley, who was at this time preaching Fourierism in the New York Tribune, in conjunction with Margaret Fuller and George Ripley, Thoreau established a firm friendship, and it will be seen that Greeley was able, a few years later, to render him valuable service in securing publication for his writings. In a letter addressed to Emerson from Staten Island, 23rd of May, 1843, Thoreau thus relates his impressions of New York. You must not count much upon what I can do or learn in New York. Everything there disappoints me, but the crowd rather. I was disappointed with the rest before I came. I have no eyes for their churches and what else they have to brag of. Though I know but little about Boston, yet what attracts me in a quiet way seems much meaner and more pretending than there. Libraries, pictures, and faces in the street. You don't know where any respectability inhabits. The crowd is something new and to be attended to. It is worth 1,000 Trinity churches and exchanges while it is looking at them, and it will run over them and trample them underfoot. There are two things I hear and am aware I live in the neighborhood of, the roar of the sea and the hum of the city. Though literary work had not yet come to be regarded by Thoreau as his principal employment, His pen was not idle during his visit to Staten Island. He wrote some articles for the Democratic Review and Dial, and made some translations from the Greek of Aeschylus and Pindar. The Dial, in spite of the fact that its contributors wrote gratuitously, was unable to pay its way, and the difficulties in which it was already involved led to its discontinuance in the spring of 1844. But although the transcendentalist organ thus failed to win the necessary public support, transcendentalism as a movement was now in the heyday of its vigor. It was, as we have seen, part of the creed that everyone should labor with his own hands, and that men should endeavor to revert, as much as possible, from an artificial to a simple mode of living. When these thoughts began to be embodied in deeds, the movement took two directions, the one towards collective action and the other towards individualism. It was in reference to the former that Emerson wrote to Carlyle in 1840, "We are all a little wild with numberless projects of social reform. Not a reading man but has a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket." The most important of such communal projects was the famous Brook Farm experiment, which was commenced in the spring of 1841 and came to an end in 1847, on which the subject the opinion of the chief transcendentalists was divided, Margaret Fuller and George Ripley joining in the enterprise, while Emerson, Alcott, and Thoreau stood aloof. The spread of Fourierism in New England during these same years had led to the establishment of phalansteries, in which Horace Greeley and W. H. Channing took a leading part. Yet another attempt at transcendental colonization was that made by Alcott and one or two friends in 1843, on an estate near Harvard, which was purchased by them and named Fruitlands. This small colony, to which Thoreau paid a visit, though he declined the offer of membership, was, like most of the rest, a failure, and in less than a year Alcott gave it up and returned to Concord. Of the second, or individualist, method of practicing the return to nature, Thoreau himself was destined to be the most successful exponent. His utter distrust of communities is very characteristic of his independent and self-assertive temperament. As for these communities, he wrote in his journal, "I think I had rather keep bachelor's hall in hell than go to board in heaven." But though he had no intention of sacrificing one iota of his individuality by joining a community at Brook Farm or elsewhere, he had for some time been considering the feasibility of putting his principles into practice by a temporary and tentative withdrawal from the society of his fellow townsmen, a plan which was possibly suggested to him by his friend Stearns Wheeler, who lived for some months in 1841 or 1842 in a hut near Flint's Pond, where he was visited by Thoreau. This desire appears in his journal as early as 1841. "I want to go soon and live away by the pond," he wrote on December 24th, "where I shall hear only the wind whispering among the reeds. It will be success if I shall have left myself behind. But my friends ask what I will do when I get there. Will it not be employment enough to watch the progress of the seasons?" A couple of months before the date of this entry, Margaret Fuller had written to Thoreau, "Let me know whether you go to the lonely hut, and write to me about Shakespeare if you read him there." It has already been mentioned that Walden Pond was associated with his earliest reminiscences. As a child he had thought he would like to live there, and as a boy he had been accustomed to come to its shores on dark nights and fish for the pouts which were supposed to be attracted by the glare of a fire lit close to the water's edge, or, on a summer morning, to sit and muse for hours in his boat as it drifted where the wind took it. There was, however, another spot with which he was also familiar, which came very near being the scene of his projected hermitage. In his youthful voyages up the Concord River he had noticed, at a distance of about 2 miles from the village, an old-fashioned ruinous farmhouse, concealed behind a dense grove of red maples, through which was heard the barking of the house-dog. This was the Hollowell farm, the seclusion of which, if we may trust a passage in Walden, so tempted Thoreau that at some point in his early manhood he actually agreed to become its possessor. But before the purchase was effected and the contract signed, the owner of the place changed his mind and had no difficulty in inducing Thoreau to release him from the bargain. We may surmise that in 1844, after the conclusion of his educational engagement in Staten Island, he was still more decidedly bent on putting his favorite plan into execution, and that his thoughts now reverted to Walden Woods as the place most suitable for his purpose. Alcott's experiment at Fruitlands, although unsuccessful in a pecuniary sense, had doubtless stimulated Thoreau's inclination to a forest life, and Emerson himself, while skeptical, in the main, as to the wisdom of such enterprises, had bought land on both sides of Walden Pond with the idea of building a summer house. Ellery Channing, who in his youth had made trial of a rough backwoods life, was of course taken into his friend's confidences respecting this retirement to the woods. "I see nothing for you in this earth," he wrote in 1845, "but that field which I once christened Briars. Go out upon that, build yourself a hut, and there begin the grand process of devouring yourself alive. I see no alternative, no other hope for you. Eat yourself up. You will eat nobody else, nor anything else." Encouraged by these exhortations, and firmly trusting the promptings of his own destiny, Thoreau determined in the spring of 1845, being now in his 28th year, to build himself a hut on the shore of Walden Pond, and there live for such time, and in such a manner, as might best conduce to his intellectual and spiritual advantage. The objects of his retirement have been so often misunderstood that they will bear repetition in his own words. Finding that my fellow citizens were not likely to offer me any room in the courthouse, or any curacy, or living anywhere else, but that I must shift for myself, I turned my face more exclusively than ever towards the woods, where I was better known. I determined to go into business at once, and not wait to acquire the usual capital, using such slender means as I had already got. My purpose in going to Walden Pond was not to live cheaply, nor to live dearly there, but to transact some private business with the fewest obstacles. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world; or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. Walden was in fact to Thoreau what Brook Farm was to other of the transcendentalists, a retreat suitable for philosophic meditation and the practice of a simpler, heartier, and healthier life. End of chapter 3.